we go. Okay, so we are now recording. So I'd like to welcome our facilitator today, Tess MacIsaac. Tess is a registered social worker and psychotherapist. Her practice is based out of Hamilton, but of course, like many of us, she's working online a lot. And Tess is also our resident counselor in the ACE distance program. So she works directly with some of our ACE distance learners to support them as well. And Tess, I will turn things over to you. And if you would like to expand on that biography, feel free, but we're really, really pleased to have Tess here today. And I was fortunate to attend a similar session yesterday that Tess did for the 5 LBS e-channel providers. So I can say that Tess does have a lot of really interesting information to share with us today. So Tess, I will turn things over to you, and I'll turn my camera off, but I will be right here. And in terms of questions, if you would like to raise a question, you can put it into the chat. For the most part, we will probably save the questions for the end. But Tess and I agreed if we see a question that's kind of pressing and really should be answered within the context of the current comments, then I'll jump in and let Tess know about that. And we will allow a bit of Q&A time at the end. So Tess, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Barb. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. I appreciate you all being here. And as you know, my name is Tess. My pronouns are she, her. And so today we're going to be talking a bit about mental health and wellness as it pertains to both students as well as instructors. So I wanted to start out just to give you a sense of what we'll be covering today. So today's agenda, we'll start out with some definitions and some key concepts. Then we'll move into student mental health and what concerns and considerations we can all be making. And within the context of student mental health, we'll also pay attention, direct our attention to what's referred to as the 3 R's framework, which is basically ways to recognize when there is a mental health concern, ways to respond to those mental health concerns, and then ways to make appropriate referrals. And from there, we'll wrap up with an overview of how to all care, like self-care for instructors as well, right? Because it's very difficult to support others if we're running on empty. And then we'll wrap up with questions and answers. I'll try to leave anywhere between 10 to 15 minutes for this. So before we get started though, I wanted to start out with some poll questions for you folks, just to get a sense of where everyone's at. So Barb, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the first poll question when you're ready. Awesome. Okay, so question number 1, and if you folks don't mind submitting your answer, the question is, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not at all and 10 being very, how confident do you feel in your overall understanding of mental health, just kind of broadly speaking? And I'll give you folks a minute to submit your answers. Okay. Bit of a range here. Okay. And thank you for sharing and for your honesty. And for the folks who are, 5 and under, that's completely okay. That's exactly what this presentation is for. And even for myself as a therapist, I'm constantly learning new things. So it's an ongoing process, right? In terms of our understandings of mental health. So Barb, if you're ready to move on to the next question, whenever you're set.
I just quickly shared the poll results here with the group, so I will end that one.
Oh, okay. Okay, thanks.
I don't know that we did that yesterday.
Like sharing the result?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll go to the second one.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, so.
Okay.
Oh, it looks like, that one's saying. Yeah.
Where did the others go? Speaking of Zoom
Did they
fun.
disappear?
They're all in there.
Technology.
Yeah.
It's okay if you can't find them. I can always maybe we
Well,
could
since we have
come
a
back
small
to them at
group,
the end.
we could
Mhm.
get a little idea from the chat. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm
Ah,
having some technical difficulties here, so I apologize for that.
yeah, no worries. I'm just going to, there we go. Okay. Is that the same question?
Yeah,
Okay.
doesn't seem like I can pull up the others here. Oh, wait a sec, there we go.
Okay.
That was easy.
Ah.
So those little drop down arrows are for. Okay.
There we go. Okay, awesome. So the next question is, on a scale of 1 to 10, with ignore my 0, that was a typo on my end, with 1 being not at all and 10 being very, how confident do you feel to assess risk factors and warning signs for mental health concerns? Got it. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, that's helpful to know. So quite a bit of a range there. And I appreciate the answers. And today we'll be going over some of the steps. In terms of responding to mental health concerns, half of the battle is just having a sense of confidence that you know about your knowledge base, in terms of mental health. So Barb, if you're ready for the next question, I'm ready when you are.
Okay. Now I got this down pat.
I love it. Okay, so we've got the next question here is, has there been an increase of expressed concern about the mental health of learners during this pandemic? And then if yes, do you feel that burnout is a growing concern for online instructors during this pandemic? A lot of yeses. Okay. I had a sneaking suspicion there'd be a lot of yeses here, so that's helpful to know. Okay. Okay. Appreciate your answers, and that helps give me a sense of where folks are at. And Barb, if you're ready for the next question, I am when you are. Okay. And I think we can, yeah, for now, for instructors. Okay. So based on these answers, I'm glad we'll be talking about some self-care for instructors specifically at the end of this talk that we're having today. And I'll be sending out the PowerPoint so you can have access to those resources on your own time. And Barb, if you're ready for the next question. Okay, so now just some general like statistics-based questions for you folks. In any given year, how many Canadians do you think on average experience a mental health concern? I'm loving this variation. Okay. Okay. So we've got a mix of results between the 1 and 2, 1 and 5, and 1 and 10. The answer, according to CAMH, is 1 in 5 Canadians, which would be 20% on any given year, will experience a mental health concern. So the answer is 1 in 5. So the majority are correct, but thank you for answering. And Barb, whenever you're set for the next one.
That was it. We just had the 5.
Oh, okay, perfect. I lost track. Okay. And are you able to close it, or do I close it? Are you able to exit out of that? Sorry, I'm not tech savvy, so
I thought I did.
Not know.
Okay. Is it gone?
No. I can try on, oh, there we go.
Okay.
I don't, magic. Okay.
Great.
So just before we get started, and as we're getting started, so as Barb mentioned, I'll be saving questions and answers for the end, unless if there's a pressing concern, but I would encourage you folks to write down in the chat box what some of the first things that come to mind when you think about mental health. So for example, like positive associations, negative associations, maybe neutral, and also like, where do you think mental health lives in the body, right? Is it all in the mind? Is it elsewhere in the body? What is it, right? The definition can be a little tricky to work with sometimes. So I would encourage you to reflect. And if you don't want to write it in the chat box, you could always write it on a piece of paper at home, right? And just have that as a point of reflection for yourself throughout today's presentation. So as you're reflecting on that, I'm going to move to the next slide, which answers the question about what mental health is. And it's health, right? It's a state of well-being that applies to all of us. Every person experiences mental health. We just have different experiences of it, right? So I like to work with the definition of mental health, which is provided by the Public Health Agency of Canada. And they define mental health as the capacity of every individual to feel, think, and act in ways that enhance their ability to enjoy life and to deal with life's challenges, right? So the highs, the lows, the in-betweens. And mental health entails our emotional, spiritual, as well as physical well-being. And this is all heavily shaped by culture, social justice, social injustice, as well as a sense of belonging, both on an individual level as well as on a collective level. So some of the factors to take into consideration when thinking about mental health and mental wellness specifically is we want to be thinking about whether or not folks have a general sense of purpose, whether or not folks have healthy relationships in their lives, a sense of connectedness, and that connectedness can either be to other people or it can also be to the natural world. A sense of self, right? And that really overlaps with sense of purpose, I find, as well as an overall enjoyment of life. Even with, you know, the difficult things, are we able to still ground ourselves and have a general experience of pleasure in life? So now I just want to address, you know, the mental health elephant in the room, which is that folks are really struggling right now. Now more than ever with this pandemic. And I know many of you have had to switch to online teaching due to the pandemic, and that is a stressful experience while in the middle of a global pandemic, right? So a lot of folks are struggling right now, and I just wanted to address that, right? To speak to that. It's a very real thing. And so there was a poll that was taken between early December to mid-December, and it found that 22% of surveyed Canadians reported that they'd been diagnosed with depression, and with another 20% saying that they had received an anxiety disorder diagnosis. And this is all specific to pandemic context. So self-reported feelings of anxiety and depression were found to be at an all-time high from this study. And so for folks navigating teaching, navigating learning from the student side of things, this is a significant factor to take into account. And when we're thinking about mental health concerns and how that shows up in our lives and how it affects us, I find it important to address the fact that I don't know that there are specific areas of our lives that can remain untouched by mental health problems when they do show up. It really does have a domino effect on most aspects of our lives. But it has sometimes a disproportionate effect on certain areas of our lives. And that can include our relationships, our sleep, our ability to think clearly or make decisions, which has a significant impact on our concentration levels, our overall life satisfaction, our appetite, which also has an impact on our energy levels, as well as our concentration, right? These things all kind of flow into each other. And our overall physical health, because if we're not getting enough sleep, and if we're not eating with regularity or other factors that might go into contribute to appetite, sometimes we either don't eat enough or we eat sporadically, that can all affect our physical health. And when folks experience mental health decline, it can become increasingly difficult to enjoy life in the same ways that they used to. And then, so because the thing is if I'm experiencing a mental health concern, then all of a sudden, daily life is becoming like, it's starting to feel like really, really challenging. I'm not feeding myself when I need to. Then I feel worse, right? Because that's part of that domino effect, right? It becomes harder to take care of ourselves, and then we just gradually feel worse and worse and worse if we're under supported. And so that's why we're having this talk today, to address ways to support others as well as ourselves. And so that's where the wellness wheel comes in, because it can be really helpful to just get a visual sense of what aspects of our lives contribute to our mental wellness. And so I really love this wheel. It was created by folks at the University of British Columbia, and it really puts into context, I like to refer to all of these aspects as like ingredients to a state of balance for ourselves. And there are 9 key ingredients, so to speak. So the first piece of this wheel is the physical. So physical wellness is generally the way we take care of our bodies. So this can include daily exercise, getting our vitamins in with nutrient-dense foods, and sleep, getting enough sleep. So it's suggested that we get anywhere between 7 to 9 hours. And I know very few people who get enough sleep. So I think that might be a significant factor, especially for teachers and students. Then we've got emotional wellness, which is basically the way we respond to our emotions, right? So positive emotions, negative emotions, how do we navigate that? What's our relationship to our emotions? And how do we handle it when things are feeling more negative? So some aspects of emotional wellness can include a mindfulness practice, journaling, and practicing kind and compassionate self-talk. So I know not everyone experiences inner dialogue. Some folks that really doesn't resonate for them. I know I have inner dialogue, and it's my understanding that a lot of us can be quite harsh on ourselves, thinking that we're never doing enough. We're constantly feeling like we're falling short. And so I would offer a gentle reframe where, what if we just like spun it a little bit so that we could be a little bit more compassionate to ourselves when we have that inner dialogue. So then we've got academic and career wellness, of course, right? So this involves overall strategies to support learning. And when the pandemic started and everything shifted to online, it would mean that folks would really need to press the pause button and reassess what their academic goals are, what their study plans are going to look like. And within this area of wellness, if folks are struggling with their mental health, then asking for help in terms of school, like for an assignment, for an example, can feel really difficult. Like sending an email can feel extremely difficult if someone's struggling with mental wellness. And so that's an important factor to take into account with academic wellness. Then we've got social wellness. So this is how we build and maintain healthy relationships. And in pandemic times, this has certainly taken a hit for many, many people. So some of us don't have, like, we still have the relationships in our lives, but if we're not in physical proximity to the people we need to hug, that has a very significant impact on our mental wellness. And also, we're not as able to build new relationships. I mean, we can go online and do that, but it's been a year, it's been over a year, and we need in-person contact. It's part of what sustains us. And so examples of social wellness include creating connections with people who are encouraging and supportive. And in pandemic times, that takes a degree of creativity. And that brings me actually into creative wellness. So creative wellness is any kind of participation or value for the arts. And that could be, of course, going to like an art exhibit, for example, but it can also include everyday activities like listening to music, drawing, or coloring even in a coloring book. taking photos of things that are pleasing to your eye. It can be really anything that just gets your creativity flowing, right? Then, of course, we have spiritual wellness. And so this consists of our values and beliefs. And these values and beliefs are informed by a sense of purpose and connectedness. And purpose and connectedness are really, really foundational to mental wellness. And so I can speak for myself. I've really had to lean in on my spiritual wellness to ground me during this pandemic. And so, for example, I meditate. I have a mindfulness practice that I meditate every day, or I do yoga, I rotate, and that keeps me grounded. Then we've got environmental wellness. So that is our overall connection to the natural world, our relationship to the natural world, right? So that could be anything like going for a walk through the park, right? Or like doing social justice work for climate justice also, right? It can look multiple different types of ways. Then, of course, we have financial wellness. So that's overall our ability to manage finances in a sustainable way. And that comes with a degree of privilege, of course, of class privilege. So it's great and it's ideal to create a budget, but for folks who are living near or below the poverty line, it might not feel super accessible. And then we've got intellectual wellness. And so, of course, within academia, this is a significant component. And folks may be intellectually stimulated through school, right? But what else are they doing for fun, right? So within intellectual wellness, I would consider reading and writing for pleasure to be a central component to this. But it's hard to find the time, especially when you're in school or you've got a heavy workload, right? So, but this is all to say that all of these components, these ingredients of the wellness wheel are all interwoven with each other. And so if one is out of balance, then it can have a ripple effect on everything and really kind of pull the rug out from underneath of us. So at this point, I would encourage you to reflect in the group chat if you feel comfortable doing so. And if not, then maybe just on a paper at home. But I'd encourage you all to reflect on what your wellness wheels look like. And this is very specific to what they look like currently in the context of this pandemic, in the context of working from home. And as you mentioned in the poll, in the context of many folks potentially burning out. And I would also encourage you to reflect on what the wellness wheel might look like for students. And so how do these wellness wheels also look across intersecting identities and social locations? So, for example, my experience of environmental wellness when I go for a walk in the park and connect with nature, which is part of my meditation and mindfulness practice, right? That's going to look a lot different and a lot more privileged as a white settler than it will for my Indigenous neighbors, right? Same geographic location, same neighborhood, different experiences of wellness. And that's both on an individual level as well as on a structural level. And so feel free to share your thoughts in the chat. I'll be sure to come back to them at the end of today's presentation. But with all of this said, I'd like to address the relationship between oppression and mental health. So oppression can really set our wheel off balance in ways that are out of our control. And I like to work with the following definition of oppression, which is that it is the social condition in which the violent power dynamics of historical forces, such as capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy, impose undue suffering and limits on life and agency. So then you might be thinking, what does oppression have to do with the mental health of students? And it has quite a bit to do with the mental health of students because oppression is, to say the least, an extremely stressful experience. And so the minority stress model really addresses this. And this model refers to the additional stress that marginalized populations experience as a result of prejudice and discrimination. And so the experience of folks who are discriminated against is additive to already existing general stress. So stress of school, for example, is considered general stress. But then if someone had, this is, non-pandemic example, but like if someone has to leave their house and maybe commute and go out and about through daily life with a lot of people, then they're at risk to, there's discrimination that can happen just between leaving the house and arriving into the classroom, right? And that is considered additive stress. And that can lead to poorer health outcomes compared to folks who don't experience minority stress. And so this is part of the reason why I really love the quote at the top of the page here, which is from the narrative therapy world, which I practice narrative therapy. It is that the person is not the problem is the problem, and the solution is not only personal. So for folks experiencing mental health concerns, the symptoms are part of the problem, right? And maybe if someone's experiencing discrimination, that's the problem, right? Where is that? Why are people not feeling safe in their own bodies, for example, and then needing to be on high alert? And so that's why the solution, individual therapy is great, but sometimes folks need community. Sometimes folks need systemic change. And so that's what they mean when they say the solution is not only personal. So this is, for all of this, with all of this being said, I should say, it's important to name the fact that marginalization can very much be a source of trauma. So oftentimes when we think of trauma, we think of it on the individual level, but it's also structural, right? And so I like to fuse definitions. So CAMH defines trauma as the lasting emotional response that often results from living through a distressing event, or I would add to this, ongoing events as well. And people with trauma can often feel shame, helplessness, powerlessness, and intense fear. And as you can see on the graphic to the left of the screen, trauma symptoms show up in very physical ways, like our bodies really hold on to what we've experienced. And so if a student is trying to study, but is experiencing chronic pain, right? Chronic headaches, for example, then how are they going to concentrate? How are they going to meet those deadlines with that kind of pain? And then if that's combined with like nightmares, sleep disturbances, which a lot of folks who have experienced trauma do experience sleep disturbances, a loss of interest, irritability, all of these factors significantly interfere with a person's ability to navigate school and deadlines and responsibilities or work, right? And so with all of this said, I also want to address HIP theory, which I like to fuse with CAMH's definition of trauma, because it broadens the trauma experience out to address more structural components. So HIP, H-I-P-P, stands for historical, intergenerational, persistent institutional, and personal traumas. So historical, settler colonial contact, for example. Settler colonialism, which is very much ongoing. So yes, it's historical, but it's also ongoing. Intergenerational. So folks who survived violence of the past, right? Settler colonial contact, for example, survivors of genocide, right? Survivors of slavery. That those folks had children, and then their children had children, and the trauma doesn't just disappear. It affects multiple generations. Persistent institutional, right? So every day, the institutions that we have to navigate, they very much shape how we move through the world, and they can absolutely be a source of trauma for many of us. And that trauma is ongoing, and it is persistent because these institutions hold a great degree of power. And then, of course, we have personal traumas. So HIP theory is really great. And it was created by Resmaa Menakem, who is the author of a really incredible book that I highly recommend called My Grandmother's Hands. And it's a book about racialized trauma. And it holds space for both the structural as well as the individual sources of trauma. So like individual meaning like getting into a car accident can absolutely be a source of trauma on the individual level. But then there's more to it than that, right? There's multiple layers to trauma that sometimes go unacknowledged or unaddressed when thinking about mental health. So, and I also just want to say that with HIP theory, coupled together for folks who do, who are affected by the H, the I, the P, the P, right? That is going to overwhelm any body, right? The body is not equipped to handle that degree of stress because that degree of stress is in the moderate but more so severe zone, right? And so our bodies are not equipped to be in this, like, for to think of the 1 to 10 scale, to be at a 10 all the time in terms of stress. And so it's really important to be cognizant of the factors that stress our bodies out so that we can then appropriately respond. But I also I wanted to address the mental health continuum in terms of how varying across variations of experience, folks respond to stress differently, right? And so stress in and of itself is not a bad thing. I mean, it feels bad usually or often, but our bodies naturally produce stress. So it's not necessarily all bad. There is a degree of stress that's just kind of like general across the board. Our bodies actually, I remember being quite surprised, but I found this information helpful when I learned this. Our bodies naturally release stress hormones in the morning as a protective factor to help wake us up. So it's like really our body trying to have our back. So if any of you wake up feeling stressed, there's like a few layers to that. Our bodies are actually releasing cortisol, and cortisol is the stress hormone in the mornings. So that's an example of like healthy stress, right? That's our body trying to protect us. But then what do we do in response to the stress? What is our relationship to the stress response? So if I wake up and I'm stressed, do I like spiral and kind of like scramble about my day and kind of get into a bit of a reactive mode where I'm not really feeling super grounded and super present in the present moment, right? Or do I like have coping strategies to meet the stress and to really normalize the stress also, to kind of reframe my relationship to stress so that when it does come, I'm not like, oh, here you are again. I'm like, oh, okay, I'm having a stress response. What can I do to take care of myself? So, but with that said, that takes a lot of intentionality and awareness. So there's a wide range of experiences in terms of our responses to stress. We all have varying capacities as well. So in the healthy range, now it says normal functioning here on the chart, but I try to stay away from the normal word. So I would maybe reframe that as like grounded and a strong sense or a strong foundation of emotional regulation skills, right? Then we shift into the mild zone. So for students, for example, if there's an assignment coming up or a deadline, that's going to come with a degree of stress, right? Like if you've got a deadline to meet, maybe you've put it off a little longer than you wanted to, and then you got to it's crunch time. But folks within this range of response to stress are able to recognize that the stress is temporary, first of all, right? It doesn't feel like necessarily like a catastrophe. It's understood within the context of the circumstance, right? And folks are generally able to manage within this range. So students will generally recognize that it's a stress response, or maybe not, but they're still able to meet the deadlines and usually are able to like still pass the course that they're in, for example, and will feel really proud of themselves at the end of it and be like, wow, I went through a lot of stress and I accomplished a lot. Then we move into the moderate range. So we're nearing the red zone category here. And this is where we see folks experiencing stress-related disruptions in their lives. So with anything mental health related, there's a domino effect, right? So depending on a person's capacity to manage and cope with stress, it can really have a domino effect. And so within this range, we can really see people kind of freezing up. And by freeze, I mean like excessive procrastination. This is where you might see emails coming in at the very, very last minute with really lengthy, like multiple paragraphs of like really personal disclosures, for example. So this is where folks really start to struggle in ways where the stress really is interfering with their lives. And folks often do struggle to ask for help in this zone because of sometimes feeling frozen or sometimes feeling unworthy of the help, right? That's another factor. So then after this, we move into the severe zone, right? So in the severe zone, students might just need to, like, they might need to withdraw from a course or take time off in general and just like prioritize their mental health and maybe return to their studies after they've received the supports that they need. So with all of this said, I just wanted to address what's referred to as the dual continuum model. And in this model, it really just holds space for the nuance of mental health experiences. And so I like to include this because if someone is struggling, I just want to offer a gentle nudge, not to necessarily like jump to pathologizing them, right? So folks who have mental health diagnoses can really flourish and thrive. And when folks who have mental health diagnoses are struggling, right, if they're in that survival mode down at the bottom of the screen there, where it says languishing, surviving with illness, it's likely because they've been under-supported. They've not been able to access the supports that they need due to many factors, right? Some folks don't have benefits, X, Y, and Z, geographic location. There are many factors that contribute to folks being under-supported, but usually, if folks are really, really struggling, and that's just a matter of support. Like if people have the support that they need, then everyone can thrive. So, and this languishing term, I want to address it. I will come to it near the end of the presentation and put it into further context. But it's basically another word for like burnout and being in like that survival mode place, right? Really struggling. So similar to for folks who do have mental illness or mental health diagnoses, they can both flourish and struggle, not dissimilar to folks who don't have mental health diagnoses, right? So someone with no mental health diagnoses can also really, really be in that survival mode zone, can really be in that languishing zone. If their mental health wellness wheel, for example, is all out of balance, then they can very much be in that zone with no mental health diagnosis. So it's just important to recognize that mental health diagnosis isn't the determining factor in terms of whether or not folks are doing well or are struggling. It's really across the board. It's not neatly categorized. There's a lot of gray space in between. And we can bounce between the boxes throughout our lives, and many of us do. So just going to check the time as we move into this reflection. Okay, 3:44. So I would encourage you all to reflect at this point, right? You've all shifted to online in the pandemic. It's been over a year that we've been in this pandemic. And as we addressed with the poll questions, folks are struggling. And so I wanted to address just the study that was done that indicated that students are reporting more stress about everything in their lives, from health to finances to their future. And this study was done in 2020 and was done with considerations for how students have been affected by this pandemic. And so I would really encourage you to write in the box if you feel up to it. What are some of the everyday stressors that impact the students you interact with, right? And that's taking into consideration marginalization as well, and the wellness wheel as well. And how do these stressors impact the mental health of the students that you work with? And you might not have clear answers on that. You might just have like a nudge or like a feeling. And if you don't feel comfortable writing it in the chat, feel free to write it at home. But I would really encourage you to reflect on these points based off of your experiences, because you have clearly a lot of wisdom in your work from your work experiences. So I'll give folks a minute just to reflect on this. And actually, this might be a good time to move into our break. I was thinking of taking a 5-minute break. It's 3:46 right now. So if folks want to take 5 minutes to stretch, maybe get a glass of water if you need, take care of your immediate needs. I'll set my timer for 5 minutes and we will resume then.
Great. Thank you, Tess. We'll see everybody in 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll give folks just one more minute. Okay. So as folks are getting settled back in, I would encourage you just to check in with how you're feeling, any tension that you might be holding in your body after thinking about the experiences and the mental health struggles that many people experience, and in this context, students. And so, and by checking in with your breath, I just mean, how are you breathing, right? In through the nose, out through the mouth, soft belly. We hold a lot of tension in our belly and in our shoulders. And so just drawing your attention to those areas of the body that you do hold tension, and just trying to breathe into them to loosen things up a little bit. Okay, so now we are going to shift gears a little bit and draw our attention to what's referred to as the 3 R's framework. So we've spent the first half of today's talk looking at the mental health concerns that are relevant to students, but then what do we do in response to that? So we have maybe a bit of a better sense of how to recognize, but I'll go into that a little bit further, how to recognize mental health concerns. And then ways that we can respond when we are recognizing that there's a mental health concern, in part due to the stigma associated with mental health. It can be really unnerving to respond, and it can take sometimes practice. And honestly, sometimes folks can really struggle to feel confident that they're responding in like ways that are like ethical and helpful, right? But if you're coming from a place of care, it's very hard to actually do it wrong, I will say. So just as long as the care is in the right place, that makes the biggest difference in the world. And then how to make an appropriate referral based off of what you are recognizing and responding to. So we're going to start with recognition, the first R. So there are a few components to how we can recognize whether or not a student might be struggling with their mental health. And so one of the signs is, of course, academic related, right? So if folks are really struggling to meet deadlines, or if the quality of their work has taken a dip, right? You can notice maybe some shifts and some changes in terms of quality as well as quantity of work. Maybe their communication has shifted. Maybe they used to be really responsive via email, and then that's taken a dip. And completely just missing deadlines or assignments and not even hearing from them on the day of the assignment deadline or even in the days following a missed deadline. So then we've got behavioral signs. So this is when folks might be experiencing, loss, especially like considering this pandemic that we're all in, loss is affecting more of us in disproportionate ways. And then also within behavioral science, folks might be experiencing conflict in their personal lives or trauma, right? And that can be, again, both at the individual level or structural level, but often with trauma, it's both. And as well as assault, right? So just wanted to address this because there was a study done that's pandemic specific to the experiences of women who, this isn't to say that abuse has increased, domestic violence, that it's increased during the pandemic, but rather women who, this study was specific to women and their experiences with abusive partners. But a lot of women are stuck now, right? They're isolated with abusive partners in terms of the statistics that I'm referring to. And so with that isolation can come an increase of risk. Not to say that there wasn't already risk and abuse, right? But it just intensifies sometimes during situations like this pandemic. So I'm speaking to that because I know that a good majority of students are women. And so there are going to be some students who are coming from unsafe environments, right? And then also within behavioral science, we might see, this is where those lengthy emails might come into play again, right? So you might see some disclosures. So again, those last minute emails that come in sometimes and have a lot of personal information in them, it might be an indicator that there's a mental health concern. So then we've got emotional signs. So this is where we see elevated emotional responses. So that can be tricky to assess online, right? Whether or not someone's crying, but maybe they disclose that they've been crying a lot lately, or that they're persistently worried and just generally kind of anxious across the board. You might also see an absence of emotion, right? So a flat affect. Folks might, seem really engaged at first, and then all of a sudden there's a shift in their level of emotional investment, right? And they might all of a sudden seem really mentally checked out. And if you notice a shift like that, it might be an indicator that there is a mental health concern to take into consideration. And then we've got just overall lack of motivation or interest. So folks just completely not responding to emails, maybe not meeting deadlines, and then just kind of not communicating ever, right? And then of course we have physical signs. Now that's quite difficult to assess online, but I know many of you folks were in person previously, and so just thinking about how people's demeanor, right? So of course this can include bruising, cuts, and injuries, but it can also include like falling asleep in class, right? But again, that's pretty specific to in-person time, so not overwhelmingly relevant in this pandemic. So now we have the second R, which is how to refer. So we've recognized that there's a problem, or we have a sense, right? Maybe and again, that doesn't mean that we're pathologizing people. We're just recognizing that someone might be having struggles with their mental health, right? And that can happen to varying degrees. So when we respond, it's actually like, I like to really demystify this. It can seem intimidating sometimes, but really if you're coming from a place of care and compassion, there's a high likelihood that you're doing it really wonderfully when you're responding, right? So if you think of any time in your life when you've been going through it, you've been really struggling, thinking about what would have helped to hear from someone else, what you wanted to hear from someone, and then just directing that outwards, right? So you can use, some tips can include using I statements, right? So I've noticed you've gotten behind on your assignments, or you've been asking for extensions, and I'm concerned, right? And I want the best for you, and I care about your mental wellness, and just expressing that you're sincere and genuine, right? Acknowledging their thoughts and feelings with compassion. Now, that doesn't mean if you do get one of those emails where there's personal disclosures, it doesn't mean that you all of a sudden need to shift gears and become their therapist, right? That's part of boundary work. But you can still acknowledge that they're going through a lot, and still come from that place of compassion, right? Also, you can, again, let them know that you genuinely care, and that you're invested in their success and well-being as well. And you want the best for them. You want them to find the best resources that will be of most support to them. And within this scope, sometimes there can be a lot of nerves that can show up around approaching someone about their mental health. But this is all part of normalizing mental health talk, right? It's vulnerable talk, it's nerve-wracking. There's a lot of stigma around mental health still, but the more we talk about it, the more we kind of push back against that stigma. So once we've responded, actually a big component to feeling confident in our responses is also feeling a confidence in terms of what supports we can direct folks to. And so having a sense of what kind of resources are available to folks can really, really be such a valuable asset when responding. So, of course, counseling services, right? That's a great resource for folks. But then also 24-hour crisis lines, right? So I included a link at the bottom of the screen. It's to a CBC article about mental health supports, but it's pandemic specific, but I find it to be just an excellent resource in general. And for the crisis line support, there is information in that article about Crisis Services Canada, which is a national network nonprofit distress and crisis service centers. And so there's a lot of information about what lines people can access across varying geographic locations. Then, of course, we have virtual supports. And so depending on where folks are situated in terms of where they're living, this is helpful. So there's again, in that CBC article, there is a website link provided, and I'll be sending out a separate document just with more information about these resources so that you can have them on hand. But there's a website called ementalhealth.ca, and it has a database of mental health programs available all across Canada. And so, right, like some folks might not even feel comfortable talking to a therapist, and that's totally understandable. Also, some people have had really negative experiences with therapists before. I just want to name that as well. And so there's going to be varying levels of comfort with the idea of speaking to a counselor. So folks might actually have a preference to start with either a virtual support or a crisis line. And I also wanted to draw attention to a virtual support that's specific to Indigenous populations. It's run by Indigenous folks and it serves only Indigenous folks. And it's a website called hopeforwellness.ca. And I will provide a link to that website in the document that I follow up with. But it's an excellent resource from my understanding. And of course, sometimes folks won't want to see a counselor. They will either feel too uncomfortable with the idea. Maybe they've had a bad experience. There are varying reasons, but this is part of boundary work, is like learning how to accept the no when we do receive a no, and then recognizing that, okay, maybe I can't convince this person to go to therapy, but what I can do is share a crisis line number with them or a virtual support link for them if they are needing support but don't want to talk to a counselor. So just really meeting folks where they're at, right? And so I also, with referring, right, with recognizing, responding, and referring, boundary work is super important. And so, right, like if you think someone could really benefit from therapy and they are like not into that idea at all, what do you then do with the emotions that you're taking away from that experience when you genuinely are invested and you care about the well-being of your students? And if they're declining something that could potentially be of great benefit to them, there's a very high likelihood that that's going to affect you emotionally, right? I know in my work as a therapist, absolutely. The pain and experiences of others has a very direct impact on my emotions. And so that's why it's really important for me to think of boundary work, and I would encourage all people to explore boundary work. So checking in with your feelings, right? What level of responsibility are you feeling for the well-being of your students? You could ask yourself whether or not you're often finding that you're thinking about work outside of work hours, right? So if you go for a walk, right, to connect with that environmental piece of your wellness wheel, are you thinking about all the emails that you have to send the whole time? Or are you thinking about that student that you're concerned about, or are you thinking about the walk? Are you in the present moment or are you in work still? And I say that with I think it's much easier said than done to separate work from to draw that boundary, right? Like work affects us outside of work hours. That's completely understandable, but just recognizing how much space it consumes in our brains and in our hearts is really helpful sometimes, because if we have that awareness, then we can say, oh, okay, maybe I can redirect my attention, or maybe I need to reassess my mental health wellness wheel, because maybe something's out of balance, right? And also another question you could ask yourself is whether or not you're feeling anxious when students are communicating with you, or anxious about the idea of going to work in general. Well, if you're working from home, of starting the workday, or of going to work, right? Whatever that looks like for you. Okay, so with all of that said, I also, speaking of mental health elephants in the room, want to come back to this languishing term that I mentioned earlier in the mental health continuum. So languishing is another word for struggling, right? And New York Times posted an article recently. I don't know if any of you folks have read it, and feel free to share any thoughts about it if you have. But they referred to languishing as the mood of 2021 for very good reason, right? We've been going through it. So languishing is described as a type of apathy. It's a sense of restlessness or feeling unsettled, or an overall lack of interest in things that would otherwise bring us joy. So it can encompass quite distressing feelings of stagnation, right? Feeling stuck, monotony, and emptiness. And if this is the mood of 2021, I mean, folks are really struggling and feeling stuck when we're on I don't know, I've lost track of how many lockdowns we've had, and I just want to say I'm not an anti-lockdowner. I completely get it. It's hard on us though, right? This isolation, we're not built for isolation, we're built for connection, and so it's quite taxing. And the way the government has responded to the pandemic is also quite taxing. That's a really tough one to move through. And so if we're thinking about whether or not we might be experiencing languishing, we can ask ourselves, right, if whether or not we're feeling burnt out, or a lack of motivation, or even a numbness, an emotional numbness, right? Kind of like that flat affect that can show up for folks. And just coming back to the burnout, it can be hard to actually know when burnout is showing up, when it is showing up, right? Because if numbness is a factor, then how are we to be then all of a sudden aware that we're experiencing burnout? So I just wanted to provide a graphic of some of the symptoms or signs that you might be experiencing burnout. So if you're, experiencing headaches on a regular basis, if you're feeling numb, if you're having negative thoughts when thinking about work, or negative thoughts associated with doing certain work tasks that are feeling quite elevated, right? Negative thoughts are a natural part of the human experience, but if they're consistent and elevated, that might be an indicator. So also, what is your level of energy? So I know that's a weird question to ask in a pandemic, right? I know I've certainly had to readjust. My energy levels are 100% compromised, but I also have a lot of privilege in the sense that I can adjust my schedule accordingly. But maybe if you are feeling drained and exhausted, it might be an indicator to press that pause button and come back to your wellness wheel and look at what areas of your life potentially might be out of balance and where you can direct some energy to. So another factor is, if you're just feeling like you're struggling to concentrate as well, and feeling maybe potentially even cynical. So I just wanted to address this because these are difficult signs, right? It's not easy to experience any of these symptoms. And sometimes folks, when they do burn out, can think of it as a personal failure. And I just want to push back against that. Burnout is a result of really struggling, and circumstances in this pandemic are so out of our control. How are any of us supposed to keep up with our mental wellness when there's all this chaos around us, right? It's like we've got a lot going on out there. And so it's not a personal failure if anyone is experiencing burnout. It just means you need to recharge, but that requires awareness and also knowing when to, again, press that pause button and direct your attention inward, and maybe use the wellness wheel as a way to guide how you come back to yourself and recharge. And I wanted to, conclude today with some important aspects of self-care for all people to consider, both instructors and students and everyone else, right? So I don't know if folks on today's call have created new self-care plans for themselves during the pandemic, because the reason I say this is because I know I certainly had to reassess. Everything's looking different, right? So whatever my self-care was pre-pandemic, well, it looks entirely different now. And I'm saying this, I'm speaking from my home office right now. So I have specific self-care strategies while I work from home. I've got, probably about 15 plants in this office, which, I might be, that might be part of my coping, but that helps me to sustain, to sustain myself. It brings me joy. I really enjoy caring for plants. So that's an example, right? Having plants around you can really uplift your spirit. Also, I want to draw attention to the transition ritual to end the workday. That's really, really so fundamental while working from home. So, when you close your work computer or turn it off or whatever, I use a laptop, so I think of closing it. Are you actually ending the workday, right? So for me, when I close my work laptop, the first thing I do is change into different clothes, like not clothes that I'm not associating with the workday. And then I either do yoga or I meditate, or maybe both, depending on the day. Because after a long work day, when I've had a full day of appointments, holding on to a lot of other people's emotions, other people's experiences, and their pain. And so I've got to do something with a lot of intentionality to move all of those emotions, let them process throughout my body. So just as trauma really does show up in the body, when we're holding on to all of these emotions, that very much shows up in the body. So it can show up in body tension, for example. And so getting really intentional about how you unwind, how you decompress, and how you take care of yourself through the workday can also feel really helpful to create a little well-being to-do list. So for example, you could put a little post-it on your computer and say like, hey, don't forget to take a 15-minute break today. And don't forget to drink water, right? Those everyday things that can really, we can just actually genuinely forget about when we have elevated levels of stress. So I wanted to end on a bit of a structured note in terms of what can guide your self-care practice, right? So when in doubt, I love drawing attention to the happiness chemicals because we all have them, right? So we've got dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins, and these are all the chemicals that support us throughout the day, throughout our lives. So when I meditate or do yoga at the end of a workday, that actually supports my serotonin levels, right? Or what if I go for a walk in between appointments, which I do sometimes, that again, that's really relevant to me as a therapist to stabilize my mood, right? To keep me level. Also holding space for laughter, dark chocolate, which is one of my favorites. So that's easy. That supports the production of endorphins. I've got 2 cats, one of which is sleeping in the corner of my office right now. And so that supports, that oxytocin production. And although we can't necessarily hug the ones we love, you could wrap yourself in a blanket like burrito style, or if you have a weighted blanket, that can actually support your oxytocin production. As well as, I mentioned putting that little post-it note on your computer to say, hey, don't forget to take care of yourself today. That actually counts as completing a task, right? That's a little win. And that supports the dopamine production levels as well. So I just wanted to address, if you're ever feeling like, oh, which direction do I go with self-care? You can always think about the happiness chemicals as a type of goalpost, or to guide you. And last but not least, hang in there. This pandemic won't last forever. Vaccines are rolling out slowly but surely. There is another side to this burnout, mental health struggle space that we're all in collectively. Okay, so last but not least, thank you so much for your time today. I do appreciate it. And I was reading the chat through during the break, and found that your comments were really thoughtful. And so I just wanted to thank you all for participating and for taking the time today. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat or to unmute yourself and ask them over the speaker.
While people are thinking, if they do have any questions, I'll just take a moment to thank you for the second day in a row of presenting this information to two different groups, Tess, and I've had the advantage of being able to walk through it twice now with you, so I really, really have appreciated that. And I know the group today has also been quite attentive and listening, and certainly putting some interesting comments in the chat for sure. I see Heather.
Thank you so much.
I see Heather's comment in the chat. That's a good one.
Thank you, Heather. I'm seeing that right now as well.
I have a question that's not totally related to your presentation, but sort of adjacent, which is like I'm not a parent, but I know how many kids are struggling with mental health issues, and I know that there's been cutbacks in Ontario with services and supports for kids in the school system. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on kind of what the schools, like the elementary schools and the high schools, will need to do next year to kind of meet the needs of the kids that are going back into class, who have had a really horrible, whatever, 15, 18, 20 months.
Yeah. Oof, that is a great question. And I've been wondering the same thing, actually. I don't know if this really answers the question. I think therapy is helpful. Having counselors that are maybe trained in the effects of going through formative developmental years and experiencing this pandemic. And I do think that there will need to be, hopefully, ideally, specialized training for folks, whether that be the teachers themselves. I think that might be a lot to add to the workload of teachers. So I would hope that there would be additional folks, whether it be therapists, student-specific counselors available, so that the kids can have someone who's specialized in how that affects children to go to for support. And maybe even like group-based therapy sessions, or like a school counselor maybe hosting like a session with a whole class of kids, for example, and then them kind of having the opportunity to process together, because so much has been in isolation. Maybe gathering a group of children and having like a group processing session. Really, I don't know if that answers the question, but that would be my hope.
No, that's interesting. Thanks. And I think the last point is a good one, because like kids, we're all social animals, but kids are learning so much at this, in their childhood, childhood and teenagehood, from their peers, and so much less from their teachers or even from their parents, maybe. And so to be able to do some processing with peers, I think will be super helpful for them, because they've missed so much of that interaction.
Yeah, the kids are really going through it. And I'm seeing actually some comments that are being made that really, it seems like your question is really resonating with folks. Right. I think coming out of this pandemic, we're really, because there is still such stigma that can show up when we do start conversations about mental health. And I really think one of the first steps is to normalize that when folks are going through struggles, that what we're experiencing external to us is what's actually abnormal. Our way of responding to it is a healthy response. We're responding to unhealthy circumstances, right? So isolation isn't healthy for children. And so if they are going through it, it's completely understandable. But that's why I think having specialized folks who are specialized and trained in the specifics of how that affects people's mental wellness would be really important for children.
I agree with Heather's comment about boundaries and how hard it is to honor them in this situation. And yeah, totally the case, Heather.
In what, do you mind if I ask, like, what parts of the boundary work feel the most, if there are specific sticky points, what parts feel the most difficult to maintain? Because it is easier said than done, for sure.
I think for me, I'm Heather.
Hi.
Get my work email on my phone as well as my personal email, so that if I'm away from my desk, still connected. And it's very convenient when I'm working outside of my office, so I can, take my office with me without having to carry my computer around. The downside is that, maybe 7 o'clock at night, and I'm just scrolling through, an email pops up and I'm like, oh, this will take me 2 seconds to answer. And then it's just one of those things. And I guess now I just noticed that, Judy mentioned that she took her email off her phone. And I think that's something that I'm going to do once we're done with our professional development period mid-June. I think come mid-June, I'm actually going to take my work phone or my work email off my phone as well. Because it's like, oh, well, I just have a few minutes. I'll just do this. I'll just do that. And then before you know it, you've pulled yourself in different directions and you're not accomplishing anything once again. And so for me, that's the biggest challenge for the boundary is just saying no and sticking to it and talking myself down, so to speak.
Yeah, saying the no is hard. And I actually very much relate to that. It was actually early into the pandemic when it was my partner who drew my attention to the fact that I was checking my work emails at all hours of the day and night, right? Like I didn't have any set boundaries for myself when I started working from home. And I didn't have an awareness of it when I was doing that. And so my partner drew my attention to it. So now I have a rule for myself where after 7 o'clock, I don't generally answer work emails. You can turn on like a little automated notification to say, oh, I'm away from the computer right now. I'll be back to you first thing in the morning as an example. I also get work emails on my personal phone. And so that's been a tricky thing. I'm thinking about getting a separate phone that's work specific to kind of create that boundary, to firm it up. But there are strategies that can be used. It's just I would encourage you to just direct your attention to the discomfort of saying no and of not always being available, right? Because it's hard and it's very relatable. Like I'm with you on that. So yeah. I'm seeing Elizabeth commented about an app that channels the office phone from the cell phone. Interesting.
Yeah, it's called Jabber, and it means that when the students, if I phone the students, they get it to Seneca call, so that's a good thing. But the bad thing is they think I'm available at the end of the phone 24/7, and they but it doesn't. I have to physically make it go to message, I think.
Yeah.
Mhm.
To grab it.
Mm. Okay.
It's difficult. It's been, first week of term, it's worse than it usually is.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is a real challenge working virtually all the time. That there is an expectation, or there can be an expectation, that we're just always available.
They sort of have a magical idea that, just like when they try to log on to your Zoom meeting at the time it isn't actually being held. They expect that if they press that button, you will show up, genie in a bottle.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah. Because you're just always right there on Zoom. Yeah.
Yeah, always.
Oh, just yeah, I see Sarah commenting in agreement with you as well, Liz. And I do also find in this work that if some people are available more than others, then students expect everybody to be available at those times. So
is Elena still here? Because I know my colleague Elena was in on this, and she's the one who's available late at night for her students.
Okay, Elena's gone now. She's not on the list right now.
I don't do that one, but
yeah.
During the
I'm seeing that Sarah mentioned a really great idea. So Sarah has class hours specified within the email signature. I don't know if folks, but students still seem to ignore that.
Yeah, they don't.
Okay.
Doesn't matter what you say.
I see.
Ignore that. Well, at least email is asynchronous.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. I can see why that phone issue would be a problem, Liz. Yeah.
Well, I was in another meeting with a colleague this morning, and a student kept phoning me, and I kept trying to send it to voicemail, and they'd call again. And the third time I finally said, I better answer it. They just could not know. What else do I have to do?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Well, it's been
about
nice.
Technical problems.
Yeah. It's been nice to have this sort of informal chat at the end, since we were a smaller group today, and so much value in comparing notes with one another, because we're all in such a similar situation, for sure, definitely. And so Tess, many of these, the participants on today are people that I meet with every couple of weeks, and although we knew each other before the pandemic, we've grown even closer. That's for sure, in this past several months, which is wonderful, and this is a small subset of a bigger group that meets together often from the colleges in our delivery of our ACE, academic upgrading and ACE programs. So I really appreciate always hearing from others that are, that are working within our similar programs. So thanks everybody for sharing some of those thoughts today. Oh, it's interesting what you say there, Liz. Your mental health would be much worse if you didn't have a job. I
On a positive note, yeah.
Completely agree. Yeah. And I see some others agreeing in the chat, because it certainly, I think, does help our well-being to know that we are still contributing to something that we all know in our world is super important in adult education. And there's lots of important jobs, but this one is just such a gratifying job. So it does help keep us going, knowing that we're continuing to do this work. I'm sure you would feel the same way, Tess, about your work. And you're probably sadly much busier now, even, I would suspect, because of the pandemic. Yeah.
There's been a significant increase. Yes. Unfortunately, feel very mixed emotions about that.
Yes. Well, thank you on that note, Tess, for taking the time to present to us today. Great information. We'll be able to share the recording with those that weren't able to attend today. And I know that we'll be back in touch soon. Everybody have a great long weekend. I hope you get some time away, and take good care.
Thanks so much, everyone. Take care this weekend.
Robin, you're still there with us?
I'm here.
I'll introduce you virtually to Tess. So Robin, Tess works with us in the ACE Distance and program in the CSC.
Yeah, you mentioned that.
Sorry, I meant to say that the other way around. Robin works with us. So Robin is our Director of Communications. And so
Okay,
she and
nice
I
to meet you.
You too.
And so Robin and I jointly work on our PD sessions among lots of other things. And so I'm glad you could join today, Robin. It's really nice that you were able to do that.
Oh, it was great.
Yeah.
Little-
I know you
little-
come to most of the sessions, but some of them aren't quite as relevant. This one was especially relevant.
A little triggering, but yeah, it's all good.
Oh,
Yeah, that's right.
yeah. Sorry to hear that.
This is why I have a Chihuahua puppy.
Oh,
She's a
I
cutie.
love Chihuahuas. Yeah. Oh, I've been relying on my cats more than ever before. They're who ground me.
Yep.
If Barb knows, my daughter calls her my therapy squirrel. But, but it's really true. You know what? I got her in the fall and I don't know what I would have done without her for the last 6 months or whatever.